The morning Isaac Morgan buried his last living relative, he did not cry, and that fact told him more about himself than any mirror ever had. It was the spring of 1874, and the red dust of the Texas Panhandle swallowed everything, eventually grief included. He had stood over his father's grave with a shovel in one hand and a deed to 80 acres of cracked earth in the other, and he had made a decision that a man either became the land or was buried by it. He chose to become it. He chose stone and function and forward motion, and he never once looked back. The ranch that Isaac built over the following 3 years was not beautiful. It was not meant to be. Every board was nailed with purpose. Every fence post was sunk to hold something in or keep something out. The barn was large enough to house 16 horses and a good portion of hay for hard winters. The house, if you could call it that, was a solid, square structure with 2 rooms, a cast-iron stove, and a single window that faced east because east was where the weather came from, and a man needed to see trouble before it arrived. There were no curtains on that window. Isaac had thought about it once, back in the first year, when he'd found a scrap of blue cloth in his father's trunk. He'd held it for a moment, feeling something shift in his chest that he could not name, and then he'd used it to wrap a saddle joint that was beginning to crack. The cloth held the leather together for 2 more years. That was how Isaac Morgan moved through the world. Every soft thing became a tool. Every tender impulse was converted into work. He was not a cruel man. His hands were rough, but they were honest, and he never raised them against anyone who didn't raise theirs first. The men who hired on seasonally respected him in the wordless way that capable men respect other capable men, the way a good horse respects a steady rider. He paid fair, he expected hard work, and he did not ask questions about a man's past. He was 31 years old, lean and brown from the sun, with gray eyes that looked through things rather than at them, and there was not a single soul in Cutter's Creek who would have called him a romantic. Which made it all the stranger when Olive Merritt stepped off the Wells Fargo coach on a Tuesday in late April of 1877, and Isaac found himself standing completely still in the middle of the main street, his horse's reins in his hand, watching her like a man who has forgotten what he came to town to do. She was not what he expected. He had not been expecting anything, which was precisely the problem. Olive Merritt was 24 years old, and she carried herself the way a person carries something they are not entirely sure they should be carrying, with a kind of uncertain grace, shoulders straight but eyes wide, taking in the whole of Cutter's Creek with an expression that was somewhere between determination and wonder. She was of medium height, with dark hair pinned back beneath a practical bonnet, and she wore a blue-gray traveling dress that had clearly been worn for many days and looked not quite like anything else in Cutter's Creek at the time. She stepped down from the coach step and landed in the red dust of the street and looked up at the sky like she was checking whether it was the same sky she had left behind. Then she picked up her bag, adjusted the bonnet that the wind immediately pushed sideways, and walked directly toward the general store as though she had been here 100 times before. Isaac turned away. He picked up the grain he had come to town for. He loaded it onto the wagon. He left. He thought about her twice on the ride home, and both times he told himself he was being foolish and found something else to think about. He learned who she was 3 days later when he came back to town for the monthly Post and found her argument with Harold Pickett in full swing on the porch of the general store. Harold ran the store and approximately 40% of the gossip in Cutter's Creek, and he was currently telling Olive, in the patient and slightly condescending tone he reserved for women and newcomers, that the schoolteacher post had been filled. It was posted in the San Antonio paper, Olive said. Her voice was clear and steady, not loud but not retreating either. I have the posting right here. Miss Hattie Byen, schoolteacher, Cutter's Creek, Texas, retired effective March 1, 1877. One-room schoolhouse, 32 students, that is what it says. Miss Byen did retire, Harold said, and then we hired a young man from Abilene. He arrived 2 weeks ago. I'm afraid you've had a wasted journey, miss. "Merritt," she said. "Olive Merritt, and I would like to speak with whoever makes these decisions, please." Harold told her that would be Mayor Dunmore, who met with the town council on Fridays at 2 o'clock, and in the meantime she was welcome to take a room at Mrs. Caswell's boarding house if she had the funds, and if she was short on funds here, his tone took on a particular quality. There were other opportunities for a young woman of her. "I have funds," Olive said, and turned and walked down the steps. She nearly walked directly into Isaac, who had arrived on the porch in the middle of the conversation and had not thought quickly enough to step aside. She pulled up short, looked up at him, and he saw her eyes up close for the first time. They were brown, but not a simple brown, the kind of brown that has amber in it when the light catches it right, like river water over smooth stone. "Pardon me," she said. "My fault," he said, which was not entirely true but seemed more correct than the alternative. She nodded and moved around him, and he watched her go down the street with her bag over her arm and her bonnet still slightly crooked from the wind, and he felt that same unnamed thing shift somewhere behind his sternum. He went inside and collected his post and exchanged 12 words with Harold and left, and on the ride home he found himself doing something he rarely did, which was wondering about another person's situation. He wondered where she had come from. He wondered what she would do if Mayor Dunmore told her the same thing Harold had. He wondered if she would stay or go. He did not wonder why he was wondering. That question would have been too soft to ask. Olive Merritt did not leave. She met with Mayor Dunmore on Friday and made her case. She had a certificate from the teachers' training school in Austin, 2 years of experience in a small school outside of Fredericksburg, and a letter of recommendation from the county superintendent that she had folded and unfolded so many times it was beginning to separate along the creases. The mayor was a fair man at heart, and he told her that young Mr. Keynes from Abilene had already been hired, but that the school had been struggling with an overcrowding problem since the Cattle Drive families had started settling out east of town. If she wanted, and if the council approved, there might be the possibility of a second class for the younger children. It was not what she had come for. It was half of what she had come for. "I'll take it," she said, before he'd finished the sentence. She settled into Mrs. Caswell's boarding house in a room on the second floor that faced west. Not the direction of weather, but the direction of sunsets, and Cutter's Creek had sunsets that were almost shameless in their extravagance, all red and gold and purple piled on top of each other against the flat edge of the horizon. Olive unpacked her small trunk, which contained 4 dresses, a set of schoolbooks that she had acquired in Austin, a tin of good tea that she had carried all the way from her mother's kitchen in Fredericksburg, and one thing that had no practical use whatsoever. It was a small painting, not a fine painting, not the kind that belonged in a gallery or above a fireplace mantel in a prosperous house. It was a modest thing, no bigger than a page of paper, painted in careful watercolors on a stiff board. It showed a field of bluebonnets, and in the middle distance a single live oak tree with light falling through its branches, and the whole thing had a quality of stillness to it that was almost unbearable if you looked at it too long. Her mother had painted it. Her mother was 3 years dead, gone to fever in the hard winter of '74, and the painting was not valuable in any way that could be explained to a banker or a pawnbroker. But Olive had carried it across hundreds of miles of Texas roads, and she would have sooner left behind one of her dresses. She hung it on the wall of the boarding house room with a single nail and stood back and looked at it, and the tightness in her chest eased by a fraction, and she thought, "This will do for now." She started teaching the following Monday. 16 children between the ages of 5 and 8, in the same room as Mr. Keynes' older students but partitioned off by a curtain strung from a rope. She had a small chalkboard, a set of primers, a jar of chalk, and what turned out to be a remarkable gift for holding the attention of small children who would otherwise rather be anywhere else. Within 2 weeks, the parents of Cutter's Creek were divided on the subject of Olive Merritt. The mothers, almost unanimously, thought she was wonderful. The fathers were mostly uncertain. The children simply showed up earlier than they were supposed to and had to be sent back out to wait. Isaac heard about her from 3 different sources before he saw her again. He heard from Tom Bright, who had a boy in her class and who said over coffee at the feed store that the woman was sharp as a tack and not inclined to put up with nonsense, which Tom considered a virtue since his boy had considerable nonsense to offer. He heard from Mrs. Caswell herself, when he stopped by to see about her fence post that had been giving trouble, and Mrs. Caswell told him that her new boarder was a respectable young woman, well-mannered, not frivolous, and did not receive callers. He heard, finally, from his own hired hand Dex, a laconic man of 40 who had been riding for Isaac for 2 years and who normally offered opinions only about weather and livestock. Dex had seen her at the mercantile and offered, unprompted, that she seemed like a woman who knew her own mind, and went back to mending tack without elaborating. Isaac noted all of this information without, he told himself, particularly wanting it. He saw her again at the end of April, at the social that the church put on for the new season, a modest affair with tables of food and a fiddle player, and the polite mingling of people who saw each other every week, but were apparently doing it more formally tonight. Isaac went because Mrs. Faraday, the pastor's wife, had helped him once with something that he could not repay in any practical way, and attending her socials was the least impractical method of acknowledging the debt. He got a cup of coffee and found a place near the wall and watched the room. He saw Olive Merritt talking to Tom Bright's wife near the food table, and she was laughing at something Mrs. Bright had said, and the laugh was, Isaac did not have the vocabulary for it exactly, but it was real. It was the kind of laugh that comes from the belly and not from manners, and it changed the whole shape of her face, and he found himself watching it happen the way you watch a hawk catch a current of air, with a feeling that is not quite admiration and not quite envy but contains elements of both. She turned, and their eyes met across the room. He did not look away quickly enough to pretend he hadn't been watching. She held his gaze for a moment, not with challenge or coyness, but with a kind of steady directness that he recognized because it was something he valued in himself. Then she nodded, just slightly, the way a person nods when they recognize someone they have spoken to once but don't quite know, and she turned back to Mrs. Bright. Isaac drank his coffee and stayed for another 40 minutes before leaving, and he told himself on the way home that the west side of the south pasture fence needed reinforcing before the summer storms, and he planned out the work in careful detail the whole ride back. The next week, on a Wednesday, he came to town for supplies and found Olive Merritt struggling with a wagon wheel outside the schoolhouse. Not a full wagon, a small battered flat cart that she had apparently borrowed from somewhere to transport a new set of reading books that had come in on the stage. One of the cart's wheels had come off the axle, the pin having worn through, and she was on her knees in the dust trying to figure out the mechanism with the focused expression of someone who has never done this before but is determined to approach it logically. He stopped his wagon. He got down. He walked over. "Pin's gone," he said. She looked up at him. There was dust on the side of her face, and she had taken her gloves off to better feel the axle, and her bonnet was hanging down her back from its strings. She had the expression of a person who is not entirely pleased to be seen in this condition, but is too honest to pretend the condition isn't happening. "I gathered," she said. "Do you know how to fix it?" "Need a new pin," he said, "or something that'll serve." He looked at the axle, then reached into his coat pocket out of habit and found, as he almost always found, several things that other people would not have in their pockets: a length of wire, a small strip of rawhide, 2 nails of different sizes, and a piece of cord that he had no memory of putting there, but clearly had thought might be useful. He assessed the axle, selected the larger nail, used the rawhide and the wire together in a configuration that he worked out in about 30 seconds, and had the wheel back on the axle in under 5 minutes. "That'll hold for today," he said, standing up. "You'll want a proper pin from the smithy before you use this again." "Thank you," she said, She was standing beside him now, looking at his repair with what he recognized as genuine attention rather than polite acknowledgement. That was clever. Practical, he said. Those are sometimes the same thing. He looked at her then sideways, and she was looking back at him with that same directness, and he noticed for the second time the amber in her eyes and the way she stood with her weight balanced, not waiting for anything, just existing in the space. Isaac Morgan, he said, because it seemed like the thing to do. Olive Merritt, she said, and held out her hand, and he shook it, which was not the usual way of things in Cutter's Creek between men and women, but she offered it and he took it, and it seemed entirely natural. Her grip was firm. There were ink stains on her right hand's fingers. "I've heard your name. You have a ranch east of town." "South by east," he said. "About 4 miles. "You came to the social," she said. "I noticed you." He did not have a response to that immediately ready, which was unusual for him. "I don't often come to town events," he said. "But you did come," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, not pointed, not flirtatious in the way he recognized from women who were performing flirtation, just an observation stated plainly. That made him stand there for a moment longer than the practical task required. "I need to get my supplies," he said. "Of course," she said. "Thank you again, Mr. Morgan." She loaded the rest of her books onto the cart, pushing her sleeves up to do it, and he walked away and got his supplies and didn't think about her again until he was 3 miles out of town and realized he had forgotten to pick up the wire he'd specifically come for. He turned around and went back, which he had never done before in his life, and bought the wire, and he did not drive past the schoolhouse on his way out. He went the long way, adding a 1/4 mile to his route, for reasons he did not examine. May turned warm and then warmer, and the grasses on the Panhandle went from green to gold, and Isaac ran his cattle and mended his fences and kept the ranch functioning with the methodical efficiency that was, by this point, simply the rhythm of his existence. He saw Olive at the Mercantile on a Saturday in late May, and they nodded at each other. He saw her at the post office on a Tuesday, and she was reading a letter with a smile that had something private in it, the kind of smile meant for a specific memory, and she looked up when he entered and the smile changed, became social instead of personal, and she said good morning. He said good morning. He collected his post and left. He received a letter of his own that day, from his father's old friend Harlan Webb, who ran a large cattle operation in the eastern part of the territory and who wrote once or twice a year to ask if Isaac was well and to say he had a daughter of marriageable age in case Isaac had given any thought to the matter. Isaac had not. He read the letter, put it in the pile with the 3 others in the same vein, and used the envelope to write down a list of fence posts he needed. June arrived. The trouble that had been building in the eastern part of Cutter's Creek territory, a conflict over water rights between 3 ranching families and the Crenshaw outfit, which was running cattle on land that 2 of those families claimed was theirs, came to a head in the first week of June when someone opened a gate and let the Crenshaw cattle into Rufus Tate's south pasture, and Rufus Tate responded by impounding 8 of the cattle. And the Crenshaw's foreman came around with 4 armed men, and things got tense enough that the county sheriff, Dan Holt, rode out from 3 towns over and spent 4 days trying to negotiate something before giving up and telling all parties to appear before the county judge in September. Isaac was not directly involved, but the trouble cast a shadow over the whole community, the way these things do in small places where everyone's livelihood is adjacent to everyone else's. He spent extra time checking his own land boundaries, making sure his fence lines were clear and documented. He was out at the southeastern corner of his property on a Wednesday morning, measuring and marking, when he heard a horse approaching and looked up to see Olive Merritt riding a brown mare at a careful walk along the road that cut past the edge of his land. She was not a practiced rider, he could see that from the way she sat, a little too straight, working with effort rather than ease, but she was managing fine and she had clearly come some distance already. He raised his hand. She pulled up. "Mr. Morgan, am I on your land?" "Road's open," he said. "Where are you headed?" "The Tate farm," she said. "Mrs. Tate asked me to come and help her with something. One of the Tate children is in my class and she sends her reading cards home, and Mrs. Tate has been," she paused, "trying to read them herself. I've been helping her in the evenings sometimes." He looked at her for a moment. "You're teaching the mother, Mrs. Tate never learned properly," Olive said. "It seems only reasonable to help if I can." "The road goes on another mile," he said. "Stay on it, take the right fork at the cottonwood." "Thank you." She gathered herself to ride on, then paused. "Is the Tate land safe today? I heard there's been tension." "Sheriff's in the area," he said. "Stay on the road and you'll be fine, but take care." She nodded and rode on, and he watched her go along the road with that careful, effortful seat. And he thought about a woman who taught 20 children every day, and then rode out on her one afternoon off to help a grown woman learn to read. And he didn't try to convert that thought into anything useful. He just held it for a moment, the way you hold something when your hands are full and you don't quite know where to put it. He did not put it down for the rest of the day. The social season in Cutter's Creek was not elaborate. It was a working community of ranchers and their families and the people who served them, and the entertainments were modest. The church social, the occasional barn dance when someone had reason to celebrate, the 4th of July gathering at the town square. In the middle of June, the Hargrove family put on a barn dance for their youngest daughter's 16th birthday, and the whole of Cutter's Creek was invited. Isaac did not intend to go. He was talked into it by Dex, which surprised him, because Dex did not normally do things like talk people into social events. Dex had simply mentioned, while they were working the corral, that he had heard Miss Merritt was going to sing at the Hargrove dance, and then he went back to his work and didn't say anything else, and Isaac stood there for a moment realizing that Dex had just done something quite deliberate, and he was almost annoyed about it, except that he had already begun to think about going. He went. The Hargrove barn was warm and loud and smelled of sawdust and pine resin, and the particular sweetness of a community celebration. There were lanterns strung along the beams and a 4-piece band, fiddle, guitar, a squeeze box, and a man with a pair of spoons who was surprisingly skilled. And the dancing had been underway for an hour when Isaac arrived and found a place near the door with a glass of cider, and the look of a man who has arrived somewhere. He has not decided whether to leave yet. The dancing paused for a moment, and someone called for Olive, and she came forward from the group she had been standing with, and someone handed her a guitar that was not hers, too big, too battered, and she sat on a hay bale and tuned it by ear with the efficiency of someone who has played since childhood. She sang a song that Isaac did not know, not a hymn, not a drinking song, not anything he could categorize. It was about a river and leaving, and the way a place stays with you even when you're far away, and her voice was not large, but it was true, the kind of true that doesn't need embellishment, and the whole barn went quiet in the way that happens when something genuine is happening and everyone knows it. Isaac stood very still. He had felt many things in his 31 years that he had made use of. He had felt loneliness and converted it to industry. He had felt fear and converted it to vigilance. He had felt grief and converted it to land and cattle and the work of keeping things alive. He had turned every soft thing in his life to practical use, and he had been good at it, and it had served him. But standing in that barn, listening to Olive Merritt sing about rivers and leaving, something happened inside his chest that he did not know what to do with. It was not sadness exactly, and it was not happiness exactly, and it was not longing in any form he recognized. It was more like being reminded of something he had not known he had forgotten, that the world contained more than function, that there was a quality of beauty in certain moments that could not be harvested or fenced or converted to any practical end. He did not try to convert it. That was the startling thing. He just stood there and let it happen. Olive finished the song and the barn erupted with applause, and she laughed, that real laugh again, and handed back the guitar, and she looked across the barn and found his eyes in a way that felt intentional, though he could not have explained how he knew that. She held his gaze for just a moment, and then someone asked for another song and she obliged, and the dancing started up again. He moved through the crowd toward her. He did not plan this movement. His body simply undertook it while his mind was still engaged in the novel experience of not planning. He arrived at her side during the second song, when she had come off the hay bale and was standing at the edge of the dancers, clapping along with that real, generous attention she gave to everything. She turned when he came alongside her. "I didn't know you were here," she said, which might have meant many things. "Dex told me you'd be singing," he said, which was entirely more honest than he had planned to be. She looked at him with some surprise. Then she smiled, not the laugh, not the social smile, but something quieter and more particular. "Did you like it?" "I didn't know what to do with it," he said, which was the truest thing he had said in years. She studied him for a moment. "That might be the nicest thing anyone said about my singing." He wanted to ask her to dance, but the words were foreign to him, and he stood there for a moment, Isaac Morgan, who had not hesitated in the face of a drought or a flooded pasture or a man trying to cheat him at cards, completely at a loss in the face of asking a woman to dance. "Would you like to?" he started. "Yes," she said before he'd finished. They danced badly and it didn't matter. He was not a good dancer. He could do the basic steps required by social obligation and no more. And she was game if not graceful, and they collided twice and both laughed about it. And when the dance ended, they didn't separate immediately. They stood together in that small pocket of their own company, slightly out of breath, and he was aware of the warmth of her and the ink smell of her hands and the way she tilted her head when she was about to say something worth hearing. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "Tom Bright says you've lived here since you were a young man and you've never left," she said. "He says you built everything on your ranch yourself from nothing. Is that true?" "Most of it," Isaac said. "I had help with the barn frame. Don't you ever want—" She stopped. "What?" She seemed to choose her words. "Don't you ever want something that isn't useful, something that doesn't have a purpose?" He looked at her steadily. "I don't follow the distinction between wanting a thing because it works," she said, "and wanting a thing because she searched for it, because it makes you feel like you're somewhere worth being." He was quiet for a moment. The music started up again around them. "I haven't had much occasion for the second kind." "That doesn't mean you don't want it," she said, not pressing, not criticizing, just naming a thing clearly. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, because honesty was the one softness he had never quite managed to make entirely practical, he said, "No, it doesn't." They danced a second time and a third, and the evening wore on warm and sweet around them. And when he drove her back to Mrs. Caswell's in his wagon because her horse needed to stay the night at the Hargrove stable, they talked the whole way about his ranch and her class and the water dispute and a book she was reading, and the way the sky looked out here. Different from anywhere else she'd been. Bigger and more complete, like the world wasn't hiding anything. He said good night at the boarding house door and she said good night, and he drove home through the big dark Texas sky and felt, for the first time in many years, that he had something to think about that was not a problem to be solved. He came to town the next Saturday without a specific reason. He told himself there were supplies he needed. He bought a bag of flour and a spool of wire. He walked past the schoolhouse, which was closed on Saturday. He stopped at the post office and there was no post. He walked back toward his wagon, and then Olive came out of Mrs. Caswell's with a basket over her arm and a purposeful stride, and nearly walked into him for the second time. "You need to stop standing where I'm walking," she said, but she was smiling. "You need to look where you're going," he said. "Where are you going?" she asked. "I'm not entirely sure," he said, which was an admission that would have been inconceivable to him a month ago. She looked at him with the amber-brown eyes and the slight tilt of her head. "I was going to walk up to the ridge," she said. "There are bluebonnets. I don't know how long they'll last in this heat." He looked at his wagon. He looked at her basket. "I'll walk with you," he said, "if you don't mind." "I was hoping you'd say that," she said, with a simplicity that he was starting to realize was her particular quality, the willingness to say directly what was true, without armor and without performance. They walked up the long rise outside town to where the bluebonnets grew in their usual extravagance along the slope, a whole hillside of impractical blue that served no agricultural purpose and was not going to feed anyone or hold any fence together, and was, beyond all argument, one of the most beautiful things in the territory. Olive stood at the edge of it and breathed in sharply, the way you breathe when something exceeds the expectation. "My mother painted bluebonnets," she said. "She had a painting of a field like this. I carried it all the way from Fredericksburg." "Your mother is gone," he said, because the tense told him. 3 years ago," she said, fever, a pause. "Your father is gone too, I heard." 4 years, he said. They stood side by side in the warm morning, looking at the blue field, and the silence between them was not empty. It was one of those silences that two people build together without meaning to, the kind that means the conversation is still happening even without words. "Do you miss him?" she asked. He thought about the question seriously, the way she had asked it seriously. "I miss who he was before things got hard," he said. "The last few years he was mostly pain. I didn't know what to do with the missing, so I worked." "You turned it into something useful," she said softly, not as criticism. "It was all I knew." She turned and looked at him. "I'm not saying that's wrong," she said. "I'm saying it's not the only way." He turned and looked at her. They were standing very close because the path was narrow. The light was clear and specific, the way Texas light is in the morning before the heat makes it blurry. "And what do you do with the missing?" he asked. She thought about it. "I look at her painting," she said. "I carry it with me. I let it be what it is, something I love that doesn't have to do anything." A pause. Sometimes that's enough. He thought about the scrap of blue cloth in his father's trunk. He thought about the weight of it in his hands before he'd used it on the saddle joint. "I threw something away once," he said slowly, "that I should have kept." She looked at him, and he thought she understood more of what he meant than he had given her words to understand. "You can start keeping things now," she said. He looked at the bluebonnets. He looked at her. He thought that she was, herself, entirely something that did not have a use that he could name, and that he had not the slightest impulse to name one, and that this was new enough to be remarkable and frightening and something else entirely, something that felt, against all his experience, like the beginning of something worth having. "Olive," he said, and just the name felt like opening a door he'd kept locked for a long time. "Isaac," she said back quietly, and the way she said it, not cautious, not performing, just real, made the whole of the bluebonnet field seem like it had been placed there specifically for this moment, which was of course absurd, and which he was, for the first time in his life, entirely willing to believe. They began walking together on Saturday mornings when he came to town. This was not announced or discussed. It simply happened, the way certain things happen when two people are honest enough to stop pretending they are not seeking each other's company. He would arrive in town and she would be ready, or he would come to the schoolhouse after hours when she was still there marking slates, and she would put the chalk down and look up, and they would talk. They talked about everything and nothing in the way that only happens with certain people. The kind of conversation that is also a form of learning someone, that is cumulative and building, where what was said last week informs what is said this week, and the whole of it is constructing something that neither person has fully seen the design of yet. She told him about Fredericksburg, about growing up in a household full of books and music because her father had been a teacher before the war, about the war itself and what it had cost their family, not in the abstract but specifically, her brother Joseph who had come back different, her mother's slow dimming after that, the years of making do. He told her things he had not told other people. Not because he was guarding them particularly, but because no one had ever asked in a way that made the answers feel possible. He told her about his father's best years, when the man had been sharp and funny and had known the names of every plant on the land. He told her about the winter of '72, when he had spent 3 weeks trapped by a blizzard with nothing but his work, and a single volume of Longfellow that had belonged to someone he'd never known, and how he'd read it so many times he could still recite parts of it. though he'd never told anyone that because it had seemed like information with no practical application. She looked at him when he said that with an expression he had begun to recognize, pleased but tender, as though she had found something she'd been looking for in an unexpected place. "Recite something," she said. "I'm not going to recite Longfellow in the middle of Main Street," he said. "The pasture, then," she said. "Or the road home, or anywhere." He looked at her. "You're serious?" "Entirely." He thought about it, he said from memory and without looking away from her face. "Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, for the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem." She was quiet for a moment, then very quietly, "Life is real, life is earnest." He stared at her. "You know it." "My father read it to us," she said, "every Sunday morning." The improbability of two people who both knew this particular poem meeting on a stretch of Texas road in the spring was, Isaac thought, either completely coincidental or the kind of thing that a man who had never been inclined toward Providence might begin to reconsider. "Life is earnest," he repeated more slowly. "I used to think that meant work, seriousness." "It means it matters," she said. "Not that it's grim, that it's real and it matters, and that's worth something." He looked at her for a long moment. "Olive," he said, and then stopped, because what he wanted to say was substantial enough that he needed a moment to find the form for it. "I know," she said gently. And then, because she was Olive Merritt and she did not leave the important things to chance, "I think about you every day, since the first time you fixed my cartwheel." The honesty of it hit him like water after a long, dry spell. "I didn't know what to do with that either," he said, "thinking about you." "I know that too," she said. "I've been watching you not know what to do with it." He laughed unexpectedly, a real laugh, the kind he didn't hear from himself often enough. She laughed too, and in the laughing the last of the careful distance between them dissolved, and he reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they walked on in the warm afternoon light, and it was simple and it was new, and it was the most extraordinary thing that had happened to him in 11 years of running cattle in the Texas Panhandle. The summer deepened, and so did they. He brought her out to see the ranch on a Sunday in July, driving slowly so she could take in the country. And she did take it in, not passively but with full attention, asking about this stand of mesquite and that dry creek bed, and why the north pasture fence ran the way it did. He answered everything, pleased by the questions in a way he could not entirely explain, because the questions assumed that his work mattered enough to inquire about. She walked through the house with the same focused attention, and he saw it through her eyes, which was an interesting exercise. 2 rooms, serviceable furniture, a clean hearth, the east-facing window, practical to its bones. "It's well made," she said. "Everything in it does exactly what it should." That was the idea. She touched the east window sill with one hand. "You could put something here," she said. "A plant maybe, something growing." "Plants need tending," he said. "So do most things worth having," she said, and looked at him with that clear look. He thought about that for the rest of the day. The following Thursday he came into town and went to the general store and bought a small clay pot, and after some deliberation, a packet of seeds that Harold told him were some variety of flowering plant that grew well indoors. He felt slightly ridiculous carrying it back to the wagon. He put it on the east window sill that evening and planted the seeds and watered them, and Dex looked at the pot with an expression of complete neutrality that somehow communicated everything. "Not a word," Isaac said. "Wasn't going to say anything," Dex said, which was entirely plausible. The seeds came up in 12 days, small green shoots pushing out of the dark earth, and Isaac found himself checking on them in the morning before he checked the livestock, and then checking on them in the evening too, and thinking that this was the most impractical thing he owned, and that he had no intention whatsoever of getting rid of it. He was going to marry Olive Merritt. He had known this for several weeks by the time he admitted it fully to himself, sitting at the breakfast table in late July with the east light coming through the window and hitting the small green plant and the whole room looking different than it had a year ago, fuller somehow, though the room itself was unchanged. He spent a week thinking about how to ask her. He was a practical man. He thought about what he wanted to say and what he could offer and what the terms of a life together would look like. Then he realized he was approaching this like a business negotiation, and that was exactly the wrong frame, and that Olive would likely laugh at him if he came with terms and conditions, and the thought of her laughing at him in that real way was enough to make him set aside the practical approach entirely. He asked her on a Tuesday evening at the end of July, when he had brought her out to the ranch for supper, and they had eaten and washed up and were sitting on the step outside the front door watching the sunset do its extravagant work on the western sky. He said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about wanting something because it makes you feel like you're somewhere worth being." She turned toward him. The light was extraordinary. The sky was doing things with color that had no productive application whatsoever. "I think," he paused, then said it plainly, which was the only way he knew. "I think you're the thing for me. I think when you're here I'm somewhere worth being. And I would like it if you were here, permanently, if that's something you'd want." She was quiet for a moment, and he braced for something complicated, because he had learned that things involving other people were often complicated. But Olive Merritt was not complicated in the way that fear makes complicated. She was straightforward all the way through, and she said, "Isaac Morgan, I have been waiting for you to say that since sometime in May, and I was starting to consider saying it myself." He turned to her fully. "Why didn't you?" "Because I thought you needed time to find out that you wanted it," she said, "not just to decide it was practical." He looked at her and felt that thing in his chest that he had stopped trying to convert, that had been sitting there useless and irreplaceable for months, and he leaned forward and kissed her, the first time, a careful and genuine kiss that had in it everything he had been converting to work for 11 years, the loneliness and the grief and the hunger for something real and good. And when it was done, she rested her forehead against his, and the sunset burned on, and neither of them looked away. "Yes," she said, in case there had been any ambiguity. "Yes, I'll marry you." He held her hand and they watched the last of the light go out of the sky, and the stars came on, a full Texas sky's worth of them, unreasonable, impractical, entirely magnificent. And he thought that he had spent 11 years being a useful man, and that usefulness had kept him alive, and that now something else was going to be added to it, something he had no framework for and did not need one, and that he was going to let it be exactly what it was. They told Mrs. Caswell first, who cried immediately and then began discussing the practical matters of what would happen to the room, and then they told Tom Bright and his wife, who had been expecting this and were pleased about it, and then they told Dex, who nodded with the expression of a man confirming a prediction he had made many weeks ago. They set the wedding for October, which gave Olive time to finish the first month of school and gave Isaac time to make the house ready in the way he wanted to make it ready. He expanded the house over the course of August and September, adding a third room that would be a proper bedroom, with a real window that faced west, the sunset direction, Olive's direction, and a proper door, and a floor that he laid himself from good cedar boards that he drove 40 miles to get because he wanted them to be right. He built a bookshelf into the wall beside the hearth, because she had books and they needed somewhere to live, and he was precise about the dimensions, measuring twice and 3 times because he wanted it to hold what she owned and have room for more. He made space on the east window sill for the clay pot, which now had a small flowering plant in it, and he made room beside it, and he did not try to justify this planning to anyone, because it had moved past the point where justification was relevant. Olive noticed everything when she came out to see the progress. She ran her hands along the new shelves, stood in the new room and looked out the west window at the afternoon light, and he watched her face for her response and found the warmth in it entirely sufficient. "You built me a bookshelf," she said. "You have books," he said. "You could have just made a crate," she said. "I didn't want a crate," he said. She turned from the window and looked at him across the new room, and what was in her eyes was that particular look she had, not the laugh, not the social warmth, but the specific look she gave to things she valued, and she crossed the room and kissed him, which he was still not entirely accustomed to in the sense that it still surprised him how much he wanted it each time, which he thought was probably an excellent sign. "I'm going to bring the painting," she said. "I know," he said. "I left a nail for it." She laughed. She pressed her face against his shoulder and laughed, and he put his arms around her and felt the shake of the laughter and thought, "This is what it is to be somewhere worth being. Not the structure, not the function, not the use. This." The wedding was held on the 14th of October, 1877, in the Cutter's Creek Church, which was small and wooden and smelled of pine and candle wax and the autumn dust that came through the south door. Mrs. Faraday had put wildflowers in jars along the window sills, the last of the season, and the whole community turned out in the way that small communities turn out for things that feel like a completion, like a story that everyone had been watching since April had arrived at its proper resolution. Olive wore a dress that she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from San Antonio, deep blue, not fashionable in any Eastern sense, but exactly right for her, practical in its construction but lovely in the way she carried it, and the autumn light through the church windows caught the amber in her eyes. Isaac wore his good coat, which Mrs. Caswell had mended at a seam he hadn't noticed was going, and stood at the front of the church with Dex beside him as a witness. And when Olive came through the door, he felt something that had no name in the functional vocabulary he had built for himself, something warm and anchoring, and entirely outside the category of things he had ever turned to use. He stood very still and just let it be there. The ceremony was short and the words were old, and they said them to each other clearly, without stumbling, and when it was done, he kissed her in front of the whole of Cutter's Creek, and the whole of Cutter's Creek seemed pleased about it. The celebration after was genuine and generous. Mrs. Caswell and Mrs. Bright and 3 other women had combined their kitchen efforts to produce a table of food that was frankly excessive, and the fiddle player came back, and there was dancing, and Olive sang again, this time with the fiddle accompanying her, a different song, one he hadn't heard, about coming home. He danced with her twice and stood with her most of the evening, and talked with Tom Bright about a water arrangement that both of their properties could benefit from, because he was still Isaac Morgan and some things do not change. Only now when Olive touched his arm to steer him back toward the celebration he went willingly and without resistance. They drove home in the dark, the 2 of them in the wagon with a lantern swinging, and the stars were everything they always were out here, and the night air smelled of autumn grass and far-off rain, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he kept one arm around her and drove with the other, and neither of them said much because everything was said. The painting was on the wall of the new bedroom when they arrived. He had driven it out that morning and hung it himself, because he wanted it to be the first thing she saw. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at it, the bluebonnet field, the live oak, the quiet light, and her breath caught just slightly, and she reached back and found his hand without looking. "She would have liked you," Olive said. "My mother." "I hope so," he said. "She liked practical men," she said, "but only when they let themselves be more than practical." He stood behind her and looked at the painting with her, and what he felt looking at it now was different from what he had expected, because it wasn't only grief and loss. It was also connection, forward and backward at once, and he understood in some bone-level way why she had carried it across hundreds of miles of Texas road, and why it belonged on this wall in this house that he had built and she had made into a home. "I'm going to try to be more than practical," he said. She turned and looked up at him. "You already are," she said. "You just didn't know it yet." The winter of 1877 was mild by Texas Panhandle standards, which meant it was not trying to kill you, merely making a suggestion that it could if it chose. Isaac and Olive settled into the ranch like 2 rivers finding a shared course, each with its own character, neither losing it, both strengthened by the confluence. She kept teaching. Her class had grown. There were now 23 small children between 5 and 8, and she had negotiated a small expansion of the school building with Mayor Dunmore, who had proven more reasonable than his initial manner suggested. She rode to school on the brown mare, whose name turned out to be Pepper, and who had been rented from the livery, and was now purchased outright because it made more sense. And she came home in the late afternoons with chalk dust on her sleeves and stories about what the children had said and done that made Isaac look up from whatever he was working on and find himself properly entertained. He found he liked her talking. He had never particularly sought out talk before. Dex was proof that he could exist comfortably in long silences, but her talk was different, not filler but substance, and he liked the way it ran through the evenings, the way water runs through a channel, finding its way around the rocks. She liked his silences. She had told him this. "You don't talk just to make noise," she had said, "which means when you do say something, it means something." He had looked at her sideways when she said that, and she had laughed and said that she was paying him a compliment, and he had said he gathered that, and she had laughed more. And the exchange had been, somehow, entirely satisfying to them both. The water dispute between the ranching families was resolved in September as scheduled, when Judge Warren came to the county seat and spent 2 days listening to arguments, and then divided the water rights along a sensible line that left no one entirely happy and everyone sufficiently provided for. The Crenshaw outfit took the ruling without incident, which surprised some people, but the winter came on, and there were more pressing things than grudges to attend to. Isaac's cattle weathered the winter well. He had expanded the herd by 12 head in October, a modest expansion supported by the summer's good prices, and the new barn arrangements he had made held up through the hardest weeks. He was, by any measurement, doing well. The ranch was viable and growing. The debts his father had left were fully paid 3 years back, and the land was his in every legal and practical sense. What was new was that none of this felt like the whole of things anymore. He came in from the barn one February evening to find Olive at the table with a letter in her hand and an expression he didn't immediately recognize. "From Joseph?" he asked. "Her brother in Fredericksburg?" "No," she said. She looked up and her eyes were bright in a way that was not quite her usual brightness. "Come sit down." He sat. She put the letter on the table. It was from a doctor in San Antonio she had written to months ago, for reasons she had not fully shared with him, and she looked at him steadily and said, "We're going to have a baby." The room was very still for a moment. He sat with what she had said, feeling it settle into all the spaces inside him, the functional and the other kind, and what he found there was not surprise because he had thought about this, but the reality of it was different from the thought, larger, warmer, more weighty, and entirely beyond the range of things he could convert to use. "When?" he said, which was the practical question and also entirely the wrong first thing to say. He knew this even as he said it, but Olive smiled. "August," she said. "July at the earliest." He stood up and came around the table and took her face in his hands, this woman he had not known a year ago and could not now imagine the world without, and he kissed her forehead and then her face and said her name, just her name, and she put her arms around him and held on. "Are you happy?" she asked, which was a question she had the courage to ask because she was Olive Merritt, Olive Morgan now, and she did not leave important things to chance. "I don't have a word for what I am," he said honestly. "But yes, all of it, yes." Spring came back around, the second spring of them, and the bluebonnets came up on the ridge and they walked there again, more slowly than the first time because Olive was carrying the baby and the hill was steeper than she gave it credit for, and he held her hand on the incline, and at the top they stood and looked at the blue field and the wide sky, and she said, almost to herself, "I didn't know it would look different once you love the place." "Does it?" he said. "Everything looks different once you love it," she said. He looked at the bluebonnets, then he looked at her, then at the bluebonnets again. "I suppose it does," he said. He had started doing something that he had noticed and not tried to stop. In the evenings, after the work was done and Olive had graded her slates or written her lesson plans, when the house was quiet and the fire was down to embers, he sometimes just sat, not planning, not thinking about tomorrow's work, not reviewing the state of the fences or the cattle count or the price of grain, just sitting in his own house with his wife nearby, letting the moment exist without extracting anything from it. He had never been able to do this before. He thought sometimes about what Olive had said, that he had turned every soft thing to practical use. And he knew it was true, and he knew why it had been true, and he also knew that the cost of it had been something he had not been aware he was paying until it was returned to him. Not by decision, not by intention, but by the simple fact of Olive Merritt walking into Cutter's Creek with a bag and a crooked bonnet, and a painting of bluebonnets that did nothing except remind a person that the world had beauty in it that asked nothing in return. He had not found a use for that. He had not tried to. It was, he thought, the best thing he had ever not done. The baby came in late July of 1878, on a night that was warm and full of stars, and considerably louder than any night the ranch had previously hosted. Mrs. Bright was there as midwife. She was the woman in Cutter's Creek who handled such things, and she was steady and competent and had seen everything. And she ran the proceedings with a calm authority that Isaac was grateful for, because he was, he found, not remotely calm. He had been in the outer room. He had tried to be useful. He had fed the stove and boiled water and checked on the horses 3 times for no good reason, and stood outside for 20 minutes looking at the sky doing nothing in particular, which was more doing nothing than he had ever done at once. And then Olive had called for him in a tone that was tired and straining and also entirely steady, and he had gone in. She had wanted him there for the end. He had not expected this, but he had come in and taken her hand and said her name, and she had looked up at him from the bed with sweat on her face, and that iron quality in her eyes that he recognized, that mountain river quality, determined and clear, and she had said, "We're nearly there," in a voice that sounded like it was for his benefit as much as hers, and he had thought, "She is the strongest person I know." The baby was a boy. He came into the world with considerable announcement, loud and red and determined, and Mrs. Bright wrapped him and put him in Olive's arms, and Olive looked down at him with an expression that Isaac had never seen on her face before and could not describe, though he would have tried if someone had asked him, which no one did because the moment was too large for description. He looked at the boy. The boy's face was very small and very ancient at the same time, the way newborn faces are, like old wisdom wrapped in new skin. "He looks like you," Olive said. "He looks like himself," Isaac said, which was more accurate. He reached out one finger and the boy's hand, impossibly small, closed around it, and Isaac felt something break open in his chest in a way that was not painful. That was in fact the farthest thing from painful, and he stood there with his finger caught in his son's grip, and thought that this was the thing there was no use for and did not need one. They named him James, for Isaac's father, who had been a hard man in his hardening years, but before that had been a man worth naming a son after. James Morgan entered the world and changed it, as all new people do, not by being remarkable yet, but simply by being present, a new fact that rearranged all the existing facts. The ranch that had been Isaac's was now theirs. The house that had been practical was now home in the fullest sense, and the east window with the flowering plant and the west window of the bedroom with the painting of the bluebonnets were not luxuries and had never been, and he understood this fully now. Dex took one look at the baby and said he was a fine-looking boy, and went back to work with an expression that was as close to moved as Dex ever got. Tom Bright rode out to congratulate them and brought a bottle of good whiskey that he said was for Isaac, and a jar of preserves that he said was for Olive, and spent half an hour being careful around the baby, and then saying he'd better get back before it was clear to anyone that he was enchanted by the child, which everyone could see he was. Mrs. Caswell rode out in her own buggy and stayed for 3 days and was indispensable in ways that Isaac acknowledged with genuine gratitude, which was not his easiest mode but which she received with equal grace. And the days settled, the way days do, into the particular shape of a life being lived rather than survived. He was out at the south fence line in the late summer of that year, checking the posts, and he had a moment of stopping, just stopping, the way he had never stopped before and looking back at the ranch from outside it. The barn, square and solid. The house, expanded and real. The west window of the bedroom catching the afternoon light. Somewhere in there, Olive was nursing James, and he could, if the wind was right, sometimes hear her singing to the boy. That same voice, that real and unembellished voice, now directed at the most important audience of her life. He stood in the dust and the August heat, and he looked at his land and his house, and the woman inside it, and the child that was their child, and he felt things. Several things. Things that he would not have had the vocabulary for a year and a half ago. Things that he did not try to convert to anything. Gratitude, that was the word for part of it, but not gratitude like a debt-acknowledged gratitude like a man who found water in the place he had stopped digging, which is a different thing entirely. Love, which was the word for the largest part of it, and which he had not used about another person since he was a child, and which he used now in the full and serious sense that a word acquires when a person of few words finally commits to one. Something else, something he had less language for, but which was perhaps the largest thing, the particular piece of a man who has stopped running from the soft things in himself and found, in the stopping, that the soft things were not weakness but were in fact the load-bearing structures. He had built a ranch out of will and work, and he was proud of that. He had also, finally, with help he had not known he needed until it arrived in a blue-gray traveling dress with an ink-stained hand, and a painting that did nothing but be beautiful. He had also built something that was worth coming home to. Not just a structure but a life, the kind that asked something of a person that work alone could not provide, and that he had not known to ask for until Olive Merritt had shown him, simply by being exactly what she was, that it was possible. He went back to checking the fence posts. He did it well, because he was a man who did things well, and because the practical work was still necessary and always would be, and he was glad of it. But he went back to it lighter, which was a thing he would not have believed a year ago, that a man could carry more and feel lighter for it. He came home in the evening to the smell of supper on the stove and James sitting up in the middle of the floor looking very serious about a wooden spoon, and Olive at the window watching him ride in. "Good day," she asked when he came through the door. "Good day," he said. He kissed her and picked up his son, who grabbed at his beard with small, strong fingers and showed all the signs of becoming, in good time, a person with definite opinions about things. "South fence is solid. We won't have any trouble there." "I'm glad," she said. She turned back to the stove, checking something. "Tom Bright came by. He says the Hargroves are putting on another barn dance in September. Are we going?" She looked over her shoulder at him with the amber eyes and the small, real smile. "Can you dance any better than last time?" "No," he said. "Then we're going," she said, "and we'll be bad at it together, and I will not change one thing about that." He looked at his wife and his son, and the painting on the wall and the flowering plant in the window and the bookshelf, full of her books, and the room that was now more than what he had built it to be. And he thought that he had once been a man who turned every soft thing to practical use, and that a woman he had not been looking for had brought something into his life that he could not find a use for and had never once tried. She had brought love and the capacity for it, and the willingness to sit with things that did not convert to anything. And she had brought the painting and the song and the walk up the ridge and the permission to recite Longfellow in the middle of a Tuesday. She had brought all of it, and it had done nothing useful, and it had been the most essential thing. He bounced his son on his hip, and James grabbed at his beard and made a sound of profound satisfaction, and Isaac looked up and found Olive watching him with that look, the one she gave to things she valued, and he said, because honesty was the thing he had always been best at and was now also the thing he was most grateful for. "I love you," she said. "I know, I love you too." A pause with the small, real smile. "It only took you 6 months to say it first." "I was getting to it," he said. "I know that too," she said. September came and the barn dance came, and they went and were still bad at dancing and didn't care. And Olive sang 2 songs and the fiddle accompanied her, and the whole of Cutter's Creek listened with that same barn-wide quiet that Isaac had first experienced a year and a half ago. Except now he stood with James on his shoulder instead of alone near the door. And James, 4 weeks past 6 months old, stared at his mother with enormous dark eyes and made small sounds that were not quite words yet, but had all the aspiration of becoming them. October brought the anniversary of their wedding, and Isaac did something that was not practical. He picked a bunch of the last wildflowers of the season, the tough little things that lasted into the cold, and brought them in and put them on the table because it was their anniversary and wildflowers did not serve any purpose except to be found beautiful, and that was reason enough. Olive looked at them for a long moment. She looked at him. "You're getting better at this," she said. "I have a good teacher," he said. She came to him and put her arms around him, and he held her in the kitchen with the wildflowers on the table and James asleep in the next room. And the afternoon light came through the east window and touched the flowering plant, and the world was everything it needed to be. The years moved on in the way of good years, not without difficulty, because difficulty is the medium through which a life is lived, and not a sign that the life is wrong, but with the deep underlying certainty of two people who have found in each other something they did not know to ask for and would not give back for anything. The water arrangement that Isaac had discussed with Tom Bright at the wedding turned into a formal agreement in the spring of 1879, with 3 other ranchers joining it, and the agreement held well through the dry summers and became a model for how the wider county handled water rights in the years following. Isaac was not a political man, but he was a practical one, and when practical solutions became community solutions, he was glad of it. Dex stayed on another 5 years before retiring to his sister's farm in New Mexico, and Isaac hired on 2 younger men whose names were Ellis and Cord, both of them good workers and decent enough, and the ranch grew to 110 head over the years that followed, and the south pasture was expanded, and a second water tank was dug, and the whole enterprise was, by any measure, a success. But the measure Isaac cared most about was not acreage or head count. James grew into a boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's absolute directness, a combination that proved, as they had suspected it might, to be somewhat exhausting and deeply lovable. He had opinions and he expressed them. He learned to ride early because he showed up at the corral one morning at age 3 and demanded to be put on a horse with an authority that made Dex, on his way out the door, turn around and witness it. He learned to read from his mother, who was exacting about it in the best way, and he developed a particular love for the kind of facts that seemed improbable but were true, which he delivered at mealtimes with great satisfaction. In the fall of 1881, Olive told Isaac, in the same way she had told him the first time, with that particular brightness in her eyes and a steadiness that told him she had already made her peace with whatever his response was going to be, that they were going to have another baby. He responded better this time. He didn't ask when first. He stood up and held her and said he was glad, and he was, completely. The second child was a girl. She came in April of 1882, in the spring, with the bluebonnets coming up on the ridge and the light sharp and clean through the west window. And Olive looked at her and said she had her father's set to the jaw, which Isaac could not confirm because the baby was extremely new, but he was willing to believe it. They named her Clara, for Olive's mother, whose name had been Clara Jean, and the painting on the wall watched over the room as it always had, and the live oak and the light and the bluebonnet field held their eternal quiet on the board. James was 4 when Clara was born, and treated her with the grave seriousness that he applied to all significant things, which was one of his better qualities. He decided early that she was his particular responsibility, and took this seriously enough that Olive had to regularly redirect him toward activities of his own. Isaac watched his children together one evening from the doorway of the bedroom, James on the floor, talking to Clara with the serious intensity of someone who is covering important ground, Clara watching him with attention that was startling in a child of 8 months, her dark eyes tracking his face. And the thing that Isaac felt looking at them was that unnamed thing again. That thing that lived in him now as a permanent resident rather than an occasional visitor. He thought about his father. He thought about the man his father had been before the war and the hardship. The man who had known the names of plants and had been sharp and funny. He thought about the man his father had become, closing down slowly, converting everything to survival until there was very little left. He thought about the inheritance that had given him not the land, not the deed to 80 cracked acres, but the pattern of it, the learned conversion of softness to use. And he thought about the woman who had come and stood beside him and said, without saying it in so many words, "You don't have to do that anymore." He went into the kitchen where Olive was at the table with a letter she was composing. She wrote regularly to her brother Joseph in Fredericksburg, who was doing better than he had been, slowly reconstituting himself, the letters longer and more present each time they came, and he sat down across from her. She looked up. "What?" she said, because she had learned to read the quality of his silences. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to sit here." She studied him for a moment and then set down her pen and folded her hands on the table and looked at him with the amber-brown eyes and all the accumulated warmth of the years. "All right," she said. They sat together in the kitchen light, and James's voice carried from the other room, explaining something important to Clara, and the supper smell was in the air, and outside the Texas evening was doing its usual extravagant work with the sunset, and everything was exactly what it was. He did not try to make it more useful. He did not try to make it more than it was. He just sat in it, in the fullness of a life that had softness in it now, real and enduring, alongside the work and the practical competence and the cattle and the fences and all the things he had built and all the things he was still building. And Olive looked at him across the kitchen table with that look she kept specifically for him, the one that meant, "I see you, all of you, the practical man and the other one, and I like them both, and I'm glad I'm here." And he looked back, and neither of them needed to say anything. Years later, when James was a young man of 12 and Clara was 8, and they had sat together as a family through drought years and plenty years, and the particular growing pains of a community finding itself in a changing territory. Olive would sometimes take the painting down from the wall and hold it, and James would ask what it was, and she would tell him about his grandmother, about Fredericksburg, and the house full of books, and the Sunday mornings with Longfellow, and the way the light in the painting looked like the light here, out west, which was what had made it possible to carry. And Isaac would be in the doorway listening, and James would look at him, and Isaac would say, because his children had gotten from him the habit of directness, and from Olive the vocabulary for the soft things, "That painting is the most important thing in this house. More than the barn, more than the water tank, more than the deed to this land. Don't let anyone tell you different." And James, who had his mother's honest eyes and his father's unflinching manner, would look at the painting for a long moment and nod. And Clara, who had made herself the guardian of the house's beautiful things, would say that she knew that already, and had known it for a long time. And Olive would put the painting back on the wall and turn and find Isaac looking at her, and she would say, with the same simplicity she had always had, the same willingness to name the true thing plainly, "You have come a long way, Isaac Morgan." And he would look at her and mean it completely when he said, "I had good help." The land went on being what it was, wide and red and difficult and gorgeous, the sky above it more sky than anywhere else, the seasons cycling through with the patience of things that have been doing this a long time and expect to continue. The ranch stood solid and warm, the house full of books and children, and the smell of supper and occasionally chalk dust, and the particular hum of a place where people are genuinely glad to be. And on the east window sill, the small flowering plant that had replaced the first one when it finally finished, and the one after that, each one tended with the morning care of a man who had learned that some things do not need to be useful to deserve tending. And on the wall of the bedroom, in the afternoon light that came through the west window at a particular angle in the late summer and caught it perfectly, the painting bluebonnets and live oak and light, quiet and enduring, asking nothing, giving everything, the thing she had carried and he had made room for, and neither of them had ever tried to find a use for. It did not need one. It was, and always had been, enough.